Nature. It can be stunning to look at, but creating it convincingly in 3D software can be a real pain in the behind. At least for someone who's no expert in the field like me. This is why in my past projects and videos, I've stuck mostly to man-made, geometric scenes. That's all changed today. I've made an effort to tackle this fear of mine by making a massive nature scene. I'm basing it off of this tutorial by Bro3D, but I decided to not watch the tutorial and to try to make it with the knowledge I already know. All I have as a reference is the thumbnail of this video. This was a very questionable decision. Goodbye default cube, you've been a real asset, but I no longer need you. Very sad to see a veteran like this go. I added a simple plane for the grassy hill in the foreground. I added more geometry to it so I could transform it to be hilly. First, I made the basic shape of the hill in low poly, then I added a subsurf modifier to smooth it all out. Hair particles are the simplest way to achieve decent looking grass in Blender, but at the cost of using a lot of computing power. I believe that using Blender's geometry nodes instead of hair particles results in more efficient grass, so I tried using them, but I could not figure it out. In the thumbnail that I'm basing this project off of, there's a dirt path running through the center of the frame. With some trial and error, I found that one of the easiest ways to come up with this result is to do something called weight painting. That's when you paint directly onto the object to dictate where you want things to go on it. So for this project, I drew where I wanted the center of the dirt path to be in red, and gradually had the colors fade to blue where I wanted more grass. I added textures to the grass and dirt so they actually look like grass and dirt. Well, the dirt looks questionable at best, but I made it better later on, don't worry. The scene was very dark since there weren't any lights. I headed over to Polyhaven, which is a website that has a bunch of free models and textures, and got an HDR image to use as the skybox for this scene. I chopped off the edges of the grass where the camera can't see so that there's not a bunch of unnecessary grass taking up rendering time. I changed the grass texture a bit to add color variation like real grass would have. The transition between the dirt path and the grass is very sudden and sharp, which looks unnatural. I attempted to fix this by messing around with the weight paint more to add transition colors. I made it worse somehow. To differentiate the dirt on the path a little more from the grass, I made two textures, the normal dirt texture that goes into the grass and a dirt texture with a slightly different color, and added a mask to the second texture that followed the dirt path. It still looked unnatural though, which is not ideal when making nature, so I thought that roughing up the edges would fix it. I was right, it still wasn't perfect, but noticeably better, but I roughed it up a lot more later on as well. The grass and dirt path makes up the foreground of this render, but the background is what makes the scene dramatic. I started off with a simple cube, a very large simple cube. From there, I'm in the shape of a mountain step by step by adding more geometry every time I modeled the shape to add more detail. This is done very easily by randomizing the position of each vertice slightly, then subdividing everything over and over again, depending on how detailed you want your mountain. I also made a second mountain to be in the distance and put both mountains into place. I wanted the mountains to be hazy, and there's a couple ways to make that effect in Blender. One way is to add a big cube and to add a volumetric shader to it. This method physically interacts with the light to spread it around like in real life, but it also uses a lot of computing power, so it takes a long time to render a scene. The other method is using a feature called Mist Pass. This feature is specifically designed to add mist and fog after your scene renders, so it doesn't add any time to a render. I tried the first method first, then realized that was just about as good of an idea as knowingly building your $5.5 billion stadium too narrow to host a World Cup match. So I set up the Mist Pass and it was immediately better. I thought that having just the mountains by themselves would be cool, but scattering pine trees around them would add a little something extra. I made this very low poly tree and added it to the mountain with a particle system. My idea was to make the trees get more sparse the higher up and steeper the mountain gets. I used the same system that I used to make the dirt path, weight painting. I also made a texture that changed from grass and dirt to rock as it went up the mountain by combining multiple textures with a gradient. The trees that I just added, I wasn't a big fan of, so I did what I probably should have done to start with and just got a tree NG of a tree and scattered that around the mountains. I changed the color and intensity of the haze in the mountains to closer match the sky while I was there as well. I downloaded some dandelion models from Polyhaven to disperse around the ground. I hoped this would help break up the uniform grass I had going on. It did help a lot, but it still wasn't enough, so I added more. I weight painted the grass so that the dandelions would be more common in certain patches, and they wouldn't go on the dirt path. Speaking of the dirt path, even though I roughed up the edges before, it still didn't look great. So I made my weight paintbrush super tiny and went to town. Turns out I still could not get the path to look natural. Very sad. The hills on this hill were not particularly hilly, so I went into sculpting mode and buckled up for the intense lag sculpting this many faces would bring. It turns out I do not know how sculpting works, and it was buttery smooth, so that was pretty cool, I guess. Trees. There should be trees here, so I added trees. Blender actually has a built-in tree generator. There's a whole bunch of presets and settings you can mess with to get what you want. I tried to make some maple trees with this because I love maple trees, but the trees are very low poly, so it didn't look great for up close. Plus, I realized pine trees would look better, so I went back to my good old pal Polyhaven to download some high quality pine tree models. They ended up not working for some reason, so I went back to my other old pal CG Trader, sorted by free, and got these bad boys. I started placing the trees, and since there were only 3 models to work with, I rotated and changed the size of all the trees so it wouldn't be as easy to tell that it's the same 3 trees. I could have just used a particle system to place the trees randomly, but I didn't, so deal with it, I guess. I don't know, I'm sorry, that was really aggressive. I apologize. Let's just pretend nothing happened and get back to placing these darn trees. Excuse my language. I tried placing the trees in a way where there wouldn't be that many of them, but it would still look like they took up a lot of space. I think it turned out pretty alright. It did look a little barren though, so I added some more trees later. In an attempt to make the trees fit in more with the rest of the environment, I added bumps in the ground for where the roots would grow. To pair with that, I edited the grass weight paint to have less grass grow on the ground below the trees too. In the original render that I'm basing this off of, there's these large boulder rock things in the foreground that kind of catch your attention first before you realize there's these massive epic mountains in the background. To make the big rock, I tried using the same technique that I used for both of the mountains, but for some reason I had a lot more trouble getting this one rock to look good than I had for both of the mountains, so I just made a basic shape, then went into sculpting mode to manually sculpt the boulder rock thing. This turned out a lot less bad than whatever this was. I tried making the rock texture from scratch using Blender's procedural texture feature. I thought it looked pretty good, but then I rendered it and there's just something about it that I didn't like. I should really get better at making procedural textures, probably, maybe. I ended up just using Substance Painter to add a rock texture. One singular big rock would look kinda strange, so I made a bunch more using the rock generator feature. The reason I didn't use the rock generator for the boulder is because they usually look not the best. There might be a way to get them to look better and higher quality, but it's easy enough to just model a rock. I just applied the same texture I made in Substance Painter to the small ones as well. For the rocks up close, I placed them manually, but I also wanted some rocks scattered around the rest of the scene to add some more detail and depth. I added yet another particle system and used one of the rocks as the instanced object. Since you can only instance one object per particle system, I made multiple systems for the rocks to add more variation. I used white paint again to make the rocks more common in certain areas, again for detail. Turns out I made the rocks absolutely massive by accident though, so I promptly fixed that. Like a third of the time that I'm working with hair particles, this annoying thing happens where all the particles don't get placed randomly like they should, but get placed in lines. I looked it up and it was surprisingly difficult to find the solution, but I just had to change this distribution thing from jittered to random. So now I know, I guess. You learn something new every day. There were 2 final things that I wanted to add to this project, and at this point I just wanted to finish the scene, so I downloaded a few branch models and a camera model. I scattered a few of the branches on the ground. The reason I got the camera is because I wanted to add a little hint of a story, a hint of something more. I placed down the camera and modeled the strap to lay gently on the top of the boulder. At this point, all there was left to do was hit the render button. For my first time making a nature scene, I wouldn't say I did too bad of a job. I can now finally watch the tutorial that this whole thing is based off of. Wait, I just noticed, there's a castle back there.